Afternoon, everyone. As people continue to trickle in, we're going to start with the ULI Toronto video, and we'll get rolling.
It's the mission of the Urban Land Institute to shape the future of the built environment for transformative impact. That's what we do at ULI Toronto. Our members work in all aspects of land use.
ULI is a catalyst. It's a catalyst for people who in themselves are thought-provoking, are interesting, they're purposeful, they're engaged, and they want to have an impact on the world.
The Toronto region is definitely a stronger, more robust place because of the championship role that the Urban Land Institute Toronto has played in elevating the status of women in the industry.
Our industry has a responsibility to meaningfully contribute to the social fabric of our communities and to be a climate change leader.
In Toronto, ULI helps deliver climate change and resiliency that is equitable and valuable.
ULI Toronto help mid-career professionals reach the next stage of their careers as city builders.
ULI Toronto is an entry point and a launching pad for our next generation of leaders to find their place in this very complex industry.
ULI Toronto brings global best practices to our city and shows our city's innovations to the world of real estate.
ULI creates really good conversations about important public policy subjects for our members.
It brings leading developers across our city together to wrestle with the crisis of affordability. We need solutions for our industry, tenants, and new home buyers alike.
The ULI network is incredibly effective in bringing in key stakeholders to build solutions to support Black communities.
I'm proud to work alongside ULI in seeking to accelerate accessibility and ensure that our built environments meet everyone's needs for access.
ULI Toronto is well positioned to help the real estate and development industry identify opportunities to meet a generational need to advance truth, justice, and reconciliation. ULI demonstrates the unique power in leveraging the built environment, whether that's private real estate development or public infrastructure, for the benefit of a more competitive and equitable city.
I am so excited as ULI Chair to celebrate these positive solutions that our real estate development community has brought forward for Toronto.
At ULI Toronto, we connect, we inspire, and we lead.
Thank you very much. And again, welcome to ULI Toronto's webinar. My name is Richard Joy, Executive Director. As always, we begin with a land acknowledgement, but increasingly we don't read the land acknowledgement so much as we speak to the land acknowledgement and what we're doing at ULI Toronto. And I'm excited to report that after soft launching Canada's first Truth and Reconciliation Guide for the real estate and development industry at our annual dinner 2 weeks ago, we will be formally launching this report in June, date to be determined, so stay tuned, but a very important milestone in our work in Truth and Reconciliation, and we invite you to join us. Today's event and all other ULI programming would not be possible without the support of ULI's annual sponsors, and I'd like to thank those sponsors for that support. Now, more than ever, ULI Toronto relies on the support of sponsors to put on high-quality programs and to drive our mission to shape the future of the built environment for transformative impacts in communities worldwide. Once again, to all of them, we say thank you. We're going to shift now to, it's a very unique program for us. We're going to showcase one of the task force members, or one of the TAP members, and I'll explain what TAP is, of a recent, about a year ago, we did a special advisory panel for the City of Toronto's Confronting Anti-Black Racism unit. And one of the TAP panel members is going to be our key guest here, as well as one of our co-sponsors. I mentioned the City of Toronto Confronting Anti-Black Racism, but I'll also introduce one of the co-sponsors of this TAP, who's going to speak to some of the work that has followed the TAP. So just to give you a little more background, for more than 75 years, ULI Toronto has provided unbiased, pragmatic solutions and best practical advice to public agencies and nonprofit organizations on land use and sustainable real estate development. In ULI parlance, we call these entities our sponsors, but effectively they're our clients. In Toronto, the TAP program is organized by the ULI Toronto Advisory Services Committee. Big shout out to them. We typically convene in a TAP 8 to 12 local experts who volunteer pro bono to collaborate over 1 to 3 days to help identify strategic, practical solutions to some of the challenging issues facing today's community and of course, in the real estate lens. The TAP hears from experts and local residents to inform their deliberations. And at the conclusion of the TAP, ULI compiles publicly shares a summary of these presentations and the non-binding recommendations in a TAP report. Now I'm realizing the TAP, I should clarify, the TAP is a technical advisory panel. That's what we call them. Last year we did 4 TAPs with the City of Toronto, as mentioned, the TDSB's Toronto Land Corporation, George Brown College, and Toronto Community Housing, also an agency of the City of Toronto. The TAP that is the basis of today's webinar was for the City of Toronto's Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit, as mentioned, and CP Planning. And Cheryl Case, you will meet on this webinar, is the founder of CP Planning, and we were going to put a link to that report now into the chat, so you can see the report that this webinar lifts off. With these sponsors and clients, we set out to explore what could happen, or what has happened when a neighborhood, and specifically Jane and Finch, has been the recipient of massive public investment in transit infrastructure, and what those impacts are, and perhaps more importantly as well, what might be done to mitigate any negative impacts. Billions of dollars of public investments in transit infrastructure and tower renewal in recent years has meant long-term benefits of faster, more convenient travel choices and energy efficient and resilient buildings. Yet this investment can have significant economic consequences, among them the displacement of and loss of affordable homes for private apartment renters, particularly lower income Black populations in the case of our study area. As we learned, land acquisition and ownership changes begin as soon as transit projects are announced. So far, more thought and policies the TAP report advises need to occur at the initial stages of transit-oriented development planning to preserve affordability and reduce displacement. In March 2024, ULI Toronto and the Urban Land Institute Terwilliger Center for Housing in Washington, D.C., our head office, in collaboration, as mentioned, with the city's NCP Planning, convened a panel to tackle this issue, to study this issue, and to offer recommendations. We're pleased to have Fabiola Yerskison from the Terwilliger Center and several other TAP members on the webinar in the audience today. Welcome back. The TAP also was chaired by Kirk Johnson of the Eco-Efficiency Consulting and 6 other leaders from Canada and the US with expertise in housing, planning, environmental, and academic and community. That panel included 2 US panelists. We were pleased to have Scott Kratz, a director of the 11th Street Bridge Park in Washington, D.C., a very important best practice case study of how to mitigate negative economic consequences of massive public investment. More on that another time. And Brika X. Williams, Executive Director of the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development in New York City. And it was informed by the interviews with 60 local residents and other stakeholders. The 2.5-day TAP focused on the Jane Finch community as an archetype for other Black communities facing the consequences or the potential impacts of transit investment and renter displacement. Very briefly, some of the highlights of our recommendations was that when these investments are being considered, we need to adopt perhaps improved forms of respect, collaboration, and investments with the communities that are going to be impacted. Even if that impact is seen to be positive from the point of view of a transit investment, we need to collaborate better. We need to understand and protect against the unintended consequences of infrastructure investment on affordability and displacement. This includes a greater focus on preserving existing affordable housing and enabling non-market developers. According to housing researcher Stephen Pomeroy, for every new affordable rental unit that is created in the city of Toronto today, we are losing 15, and I've heard this number to be as high as 18, and in the case of Ottawa, it's over 30 spaces from displacement or demolition. So a significant hole in the bottom of the bucket around affordable housing that isn't being offset by new supply. Purposefully align, and the third recommendation is to purposely align and leverage various initiatives for decarbonization, electrification, housing affordability, and displacement, housing preservation, supply, and transit and community benefits in the same forward direction. So these ideas shouldn't be competing and potentially negating each other. They should be arranged so that they're actually supporting each other. So with that background, I'm now going to just briefly introduce our speaker. I mentioned one of the top panelists, Dr. Nimoy Lewis. Dr. Nimoy Lewis is about to publish some of his research that he'll be speaking to today in the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. And he's giving our audience an unvarnished preview of that publication, and followed by Nimoy, as CP Planning's founder Cheryl Case will come in and speak to some of the work that her organization is doing to respond to the top recommendations and other work that she's been doing in the Jane Finch community and other Black communities in Toronto, to mitigate against some of these impacts that have been uncovered in the research that Nimoy will be speaking to. So Nimoy, we're always skimpy with introductions, so you'll excuse us for introducing you mostly in the chat, where we'll put your mini bio for the audience to see, and the same goes for Cheryl. So without further ado, at 12:14 already, I want to turn the floor over to you, and if we have time, we will take audience questions toward the end of this, but we're going to be, I think, pretty jam-packed. Nimoy, over to you.
Thank you for that, and thank you for that warm introduction, and thank you for everyone attending today's webinar. If we could just bring up the first slide. Okay, so today's talk, we're going to talk about some of our guided research questions for the paper and some of the guiding frameworks that we use to understand these phenomenons that we're studying, and most importantly, to understand that these phenomenons are not just created in a vacuum, but it's important for us to contextualize how these findings evolve and produce themselves within various communities. I'll briefly go over our research methods and findings, and then get over to our discussion, and then wrap things up. Next slide. So some of our guided research question is, we wanted to know why our Black renter communities in Toronto facing such high levels of evictions. And this really stems from a 2020 report that was published by the Wellesley Institute that found that Black renter communities face a high level of evictions. But the story sort of ends right there. And so we wanted to understand who are responsible for these high levels of evictions in communities. But we also wanted to understand, what is the relationship between landlord types and eviction filing rates / practices in these communities? And the last point we won't really cover, but really this speaks to more of our framework and understanding how can racial capitalism and anti-Blackness help us to better understand the financialization of rental housing and its uneven consequences in Toronto. Next slide. So when we think about why naming anti-Blackness matters in housing, infrastructure, and transit planning, it's important for us to understand, what does this look like? So we can admit that we live in a very stratified society, and where political discourse often fixates on the middle class, but oftentimes it doesn't just reflect economic concerns. It's important for us to understand that it actively defines who is seen as deserving of protection and investment and who is excluded. This sort of rhetoric helps to naturalize, we argue, inequity by ignoring some of the structural barriers that's faced by low-income and racialized community. But secondly, it's important for us to also understand that inequity is not personal. It is produced. So cultural theorists and critical sociologists remind us that individual failings are not a cause of housing insecurity. Rather, systemic forces, including exclusionary policies, zoning laws, and market-driven planning, decide who gets to stay and who gets pushed out. But it's also very much important for us to understand that access to stable and dignified housing is shaped by governing architectures of inequality. An interlocking system where race, class, gender determines not just where people live, but rather they are granted the right to remain, participate, and belong in urban life. And lastly, it's important for us to recognize that the ability to remain within your community is a political action. Who is allowed to stay and thrive is not just a matter of income. It reflects a structural decisions about whose presence is welcomed and who is seen as expendable in the ongoing remaking of our city. Next slide. So as I mentioned, inequities is not just a result of chance. They are structured. Laws, policies, and market logics do not operate in a vacuum, as I mentioned earlier. They are designed in ways that prioritize capital investment, which disproportionately benefits developers and landlords while exposing racialized and working class communities to the harm, exclusion, and displacement. But it's important for us also to understand that displacement is not incidental. It is built into our systems. These frameworks do not fail vulnerable communities. They work as they're intended to, reinforcing a political economy that protects assets over people and growth over justice. So my research shows how financialized landlords profit from inequity. These actors are not passive, and it's important for us to stress that point. They actively participate in the spatial restructuring and reordering of cities, acquiring properties in Black neighborhoods that have historically been undervalued, disinvested, or abandoned by our state, and then leveraging longstanding equities to generate returns. Their strategies reveal the architecture of what we call the architecture of exclusion. Tenant turnovers, rent hikes, and asset repositionings are not just business practices. They are mechanisms of stratification used to remove those who are no longer seen profitable and replace with those who are. So profit is prioritized over people's right to remain. At the heart of this model is a logic that treats housing as a commodity, not a right. The goal is not stability, but the return on investment, often at the cost of uprooting communities that have long sustained neighborhoods and are being removed. Next slide. So it's important for us to understand what do we mean by financialization? And oftentimes we've seen that financialization has entered the political discourse as well. So how I define financialization is borrowing a definition by economic geographer Manuel Albers, who defines financialization as the increasing dominance of financial actors, markets, and practices and measurements, narratives at various scales resulting in structural transformation of economies, firms, including financial institutions, but also states and households. But in the context of housing, we define financialization or financialized landlords as privately held or publicly traded companies that invest in multifamily housing at a substantial scale. They leverage sophisticated financial instruments and analytics, and they're oftentimes funded by external investor capital, internal resources, or a combination of both. And they're driven by a focus of pursuit of maximizing revenue and asset value. But these entities are driven by a singular objective, the maximization of revenue and asset value rather than the provisions of housing as a social good. Next slide. And some of the key strategies are the securitization of rent, where we turn future rent payments into financial products. And happens oftentimes through using special purpose vehicles like trust, partnerships, joint ventures, and corporations for property acquisitions. And as a result, these help to gain favorable tax treatments and legal insulation. But as we've seen in most recent news, just last year and even this year in Canada, the introduction of dynamic pricing strategies, in where rents are adjusted in real time using advanced analytics, or where we're prioritizing market responsiveness over affordability. And so financialized landlords differ from conventional owners, not by their legal form, but by their strategic orientation. And where housing is treated as its use value, housing is not treated for its use value, and instead for its exchange value or return potential. Next slide. And so it's important for us to understand, how do we come up with these categorizations of landlords? And so as a result, we acquired about 27 years of multifamily acquisition data in the city of Toronto, so from 1995 to 2022. And as a result, one of the struggles that we had initially was measuring the presence of financial actors. It was hindered by the fact that financial actors operate through intentionally opaque corporate structures, making the ownership networks often difficult to trace. And this is often because a lot of these companies lack publicly available property ownership or corporate information. And so it was important for us to untangle this ownership network to reveal the true beneficiaries of financialized real estate. And identifying who the true owners requires moving beyond the listed registered owner on the property records, but to trace the links to the parent companies and investment vehicles. And so this analysis required a multi-source of investigative approaches, combining land registry data, third-party corporate searches to expose some of the shell companies in the web of ownership, but also using commercial analytics databases. And as a result, next slide. And as a result, we found that financialized landlords over the course of between 1995 and 2022 accounted for 64% of the units transacted in the city of Toronto. That's north of over 142,000 rental units. But we argue that this is most likely an undercount, largely because of the fact that there are various companies just because of not having an unlimited budget, we were not able to do a whole bunch of corporate searches on all of these entities. So we stress that this number is most likely an undercount. Next slide. And so far, we also included within our database, we, through a Freedom of Information request, acquired all the evictions data for the province of Ontario from 2010 to 2023 for the entire province. And so far, with our particular research, we're focused in particular on the city of Toronto during that time period. And so our goal is to manually clean all of the city of Toronto's eviction data by also identifying who those true owners are, what are those landlord subtypes, whether they're asset managers, real estate investment trusts, or private equity or insurance companies. And to date, we've manually cleaned roughly about 220,000 eviction filings so far. So that is from 2013 to 2023. And we're in the process of finishing cleaning 2010 to 2012. And so a lot of this it requires in terms of cleaning up the database, cleaning up the eviction data, largely because it's such in bad shape. So it's important that we make corrections to the property address, postal codes, and also dispositions. But most importantly, through these, we assign who are the true owners of these eviction filings. As I mentioned, who is these landlords or subtypes. But we also create our own building typology, whether where the home and where eviction is being filed, whether it's a low-rise, mid-rise, high-rise, semi-detached, single family, and et cetera, or commercial residential. And then we also make the distinction whether they're primary and secondary rental markets. Next slide. And so, as I mentioned, we geocoded all of these addresses with a 99% success rate. So for the paper, we focused on 2016 and 2021. But for the purpose of this presentation, we've expanded the scope to include from 2013 to 2021. And so this is the first time it's also being, we're also sharing this data publicly. And so because of the fact that the Landlord and Tenant Board does not collect race, we rely on custom renter demographic data from Statistics Canada and linking these to our evictions data with DAs of ethno-cultural and / racial renter majority. So meaning as this allows, so the dissemination areas is the lowest geography within the census, which allows us to produce more granular analysis at the community and neighborhood level. We calculated our eviction rates focusing on the primary rental market, largely because the secondary rental market, it's hard to delineate which units within that particular property is a rental unit and which is occupied by the owner. And so we calculated this by rental units, as I mentioned, rather than per renter households. And we also calculated at the building level, at the aggregated DA level, as I mentioned. And we also conducted an ANOVA statistical test and a post-hoc test to explore the relationship between DA ratio majority, eviction rates, and landlord types. Next slide. And so we've produced this particular map that identifies across the city of Toronto using the latest census of which areas are Black renter majority areas, meaning that these are areas that have over 50% Black population and over 50% rental population. As you can see, those that are in the bold purple are those that are within between 50 and 100% renters, which are low income. And I must make this distinction that when you say low income and high income in this data set, it's where those particular renter households fall on the median of that particular DA, and whether they're on the lower end or on the higher end. Next slide. And so when we look at some of the areas with some of the highest eviction rates, specifically by financialized landlords, we see that a cluster of these eviction rates are clustered in the northwest quadrant of the city, and communities like Weston, the Chalk Farm community, and in Jane and Finch, including various properties along York University Heights, Fountainhead, and 10 San Romano Way and Murray Ross Parkway, but also in the North Albion community, which is also within that Finch LRT corridor. And we'll specifically highlight a particular property in the North Albion community, which is the 2737, 2757, as an example of what we mean in terms of how these struggles are being produced within communities. Next slide. So when we look at some of the eviction rates across the city between 2013 and 2021 that are within 800 meters of the existing or anticipated transit infrastructure, what we found was that the Eglinton Crosstown and the Finch West LRT had elevated risk of evictions, where both the corridors show consistently high rates of evictions rates than the Toronto average, especially between the periods of 2015 and 2019, which suggested a link between anticipated infrastructure delivery and growing housing instability. These elevated rates may reflect the displacement pressures placed on longstanding tenants as neighborhoods undergo speculative transformation. But what we also see is that Weston and areas like Weston and around the Kennedy Station exhibit more stability, where eviction rates near Weston and Kennedy Station remain close to or below the city average for most of those observed during that period. Relative stability may reflect a different market pressures or the maturity of transit nodes, where speculative rent seeking is less aggressive. But it's important for us to understand that Toronto's average masks the localized risk, where citywide evictions hovers around 5 to 6 per 100 rental units, but it obscures the pockets heightened displacement risk concentrated near transit corridors. This underlines the importance of spatially disaggregated analysis in understanding housing precarity. Next slide. But then when we zoom into particular corridors like the Finch West LRT corridor, and when we focus specifically on financialized landlords, What we see is a consistently filed eviction rates at disproportionately high rates in Black renter majority neighborhoods within the corridor, far exceeding the city average from 2013 to 2021. This is not a matter, and so it's important for us to understand that this is not a matter of volatility, but rather long-standing patterns of targeted housing instability, and where dispossession is a racial pattern. At its peak, eviction rates in Black renter majority areas we see reach over 30 per 100 renter units, a rate that's significantly higher than in mixed or South Asian majority, which is not surprising considering the fact that Black renters and South Asian renters are two of the most rent burdened groups in the city of Toronto. But these disparities suggest that Black renters face heightened exposures of displacement, not as a coincidence, but as a feature of how financialized landlords manage risk and extract value. So infrastructure here, we argue, becomes a catalyst of displacement. The focus on areas within 800 meters of the Finch LRT underscores how transit investments intersects with precarity. Rather than benefit long-standing communities such as infrastructure can trigger intensified eviction activity and speculative turnover, particularly in racialized areas. But it's important for us to reframe the eviction narrative. The evidence unsettles dominant narratives that frame eviction as an outcome of individual tenant failure or impersonal market pressure. Instead, it exposes the systemic architecture of racialized dispossession, where housing precarity is structured not incidental to how real estate capital circulates and consolidates power. Next slide. So as you can see, here we list the top 10 filers of eviction during this particular period. Toronto Community Housing is number one as filing the most eviction, but it's important for us to look at the list also below at the number of units under management for each year of where those evictions are being filed. So we see that there's a significant or a large number of units within Toronto Community Housing's portfolio, which helps us to understand their lower eviction rates, and where their eviction rates is roughly below the city average during this time period of between 2013 and 2021, which is about 2.7. Next, we see Cap REIT, in which their eviction filings is approximately slightly over the city average of 5.5. But number three, we see Starlight Investment at 10.2. And this is significant because, as we can see, that their eviction filing rates double the city average. But when we look at particular companies that no longer operate within the rental space, like the Wynn Wynn family group of companies, we see significantly high rates of evictions, even as high as 36 per 100 renter unit household. Next. So some of their key findings that financialized landlords do not file evictions at equal rates across the city. And in fact, Black renter majority dissemination areas face rates anywhere between 14 and 33%, and where higher income Black DAs had the highest rates of evictions. So financialized landlords filed eviction for non-payment of rent at a higher rate than other private landlords. But in fact, private non-financialized landlords also file at high rates in Black DAs as well, but overall lower than financialized landlords as a citywide average. And as a result, we also found that Toronto Community Housing files at a consistent and low rates across racialized renter majority communities. But it's important for us to highlight Starlight Investment, Toronto's largest private landlord, which files for non-payment rate at a higher rate in Black majority renter areas versus racialized renters. Next slide. So some of the key findings, as we can see, we found that financialized landlords are filing in Black low-income areas at 14%, and in Black high-income areas at 33%. But when we look at that in comparison to Toronto Community Housing, we see that these are between 4% in low income and 3%, which is roughly around their average for the city as a whole. Next slide. And then when we look at in terms of what sort of applications are being filed, I want to draw our attention to Starlight Investment, as I mentioned, in where Black low-income majority areas where they file up 90%, 99% of their evictions between 2016 and 2021 were for non-payment of rent. And while in high-income areas, it was 97%. Next slide. And then when we look at in terms of when we look at the cumulative aggregate growth rates in terms of average rents in the city between 2013 and 2021, where evictions have been filed, we see that when we look specifically at the northwest quadrant of the city, we see that these not all neighborhoods are treated equally. In fact, many in the northwest and northeast Toronto have become targets of intensified rent extraction, revealing that strategic preferences for profit-making in disinvested areas. But this geography of extraction mirrors also a geography of dispossession, where the map traces how financialized rental practices overlay onto pre-existing patterns of racial and economic marginalization, where these rent trajectories reflect not a neutral market adjustment, but a deliberate leveraging of place-based inequalities to extract value. Next slide. And this is where we take much more of a deeper look and where we see some of those high rates of rents on new leases, and where when we look at the southern portion of Jane and Finch, we see some of the highest in that particular community, where the effective average effective rents in those particular areas range from anywhere between 6.97% increase or 7.95% annually. But also when we look at in the North Albion community in North Rexdale, we see it has some of the highest when we look at more specifically Black renter majority areas in where those increases are anywhere 8% or higher. Next slide. So it's important for us to understand how does these practices particularly work. So as I mentioned, we highlight this particular property, which is located within the Finch West LRT corridor, which is a property that was acquired by Starlight Investment in 2018 for approximately over $162 million. What we saw from our data was within just over a year, Starlight filed 569 evictions alone at this particular property. Just to give some context, there's 759 units at this particular property, which one would suggest that over 70% of the building received an eviction notice. But it's important for us to highlight that serial eviction filings are occurring in many of these buildings where a single unit might receive more than one eviction filings per year. But we want to draw our attention also to some of the rent increases that we're seeing at this particular property. And where at the start of the pandemic, Starlight was increasing the charging rents on effective rents at approximately 22.9% on new leases, which is significantly higher than the CPI index for shelter for both Ontario and the GTA and even Canada. But I also want us to draw our attention to 2024, where we see a significant drop-off. We theorize that this is possibly due to a shift in the demand dynamics, where the potential slowdown in immigration and household formation may have erased pressure on the rental market, with fewer new rental units entering the market, and such demand has softened, particularly in higher cost rental units, where continued rental supply through acquisition, repositioning, and new completions may have resulted in higher vacancy rates and a growing difficulty to lease in units at inflated price points. But it's important for us to understand that this is not a gesture of goodwill. What we should see this as a strategic retrenchment or not structural change. The rent decrease reflects a market recalibration, not a reversal of extractive practices. It underscores the limits of speculative rent inflation in the context where affordability thresholds have already been stretched thin. But it's important, next slide. And when we think about this in the context of policy, Black neighborhoods decline is not a natural organic process. It's manufactured actually through policy. Across municipal, provincial, and federal level, housing and planning decisions have worked in tandem to constrain Black life, while clearing pathways for redevelopment under the banner of growth and progress. So when we think about it at the municipal level, zoning tools, we see zoning as a tool of selective protection. Toronto's use of inclusionary zoning only in high growth zones reflect whose affordability matters. Meanwhile, exclusionary zoning in predominantly white single-family areas restricts the development of multi-unit affordable units and entrenching patterns of racial and economic segregation. But when we look at in terms of provincial deregulation and displacement, the erosion of tenant protection, especially post-2018 and during the pandemic, has left Black renters particularly vulnerable. Planning frameworks like the PPS or the growth plan promote intensification, but lack safeguards against displacement, effectively opening the door to speculation. And when we think about the federal level, the retreat from non-market housing investment since the 1990s responsibility has shifted to the private sector. Tools like the Rental Construction Finance Initiative prioritize financing over affordability, leaving those most in need are structurally excluded. Promises of equity then remains largely rhetorical. And when we look at in terms of these policies do not operate in isolations, it's important for us to understand that they collectively form our architecture of abandonment where disinvestment lays the groundwork for market investment. In this context, eviction becomes a mechanism that clears the way for gentrification while displacing the very communities that have endured systemic neglect. Next slide. So it's important for us to understand that eviction is not simply a consequence of poverty. It reflects deeper racialized dynamics within housing system. Higher eviction rates do not always align with the lowest income areas, challenging the idea of economic hardship alone to explain displacement. As a result, it's important for us to recognize that race has become embedded in how value and risk is assigned. Black neighborhoods are devalued to justify disinvestment, then reinvested in ways that displace long-standing residents. Eviction patterns are shaped by structural conditions, including ownership models, speculative investment, and filing behaviors like serial evictions, especially in financialized rental housing. So it's important for us to end off to suggest what these patterns make clear is that eviction is not simply an outcome of personal hardship or market logic. It's a spatial and racialized practice, shaped by how value is extracted, where risk is assigned, and who is seen as expendable to the pursuit of returns on investments. The intersection of infrastructure investment and financialized ownership don't just transform neighborhoods, they reorder them to determine who gets to belong within them. If left unchallenged, these dynamics will continue to undermine the conditions for housing security, particularly for Black renters, by embedding displacement in the very mechanism they claim to create growth. So the task ahead is not simply to monitor these trends, but to ask who is being asked to move and for whom and at what cost. Only by centering these questions can we begin to imagine housing futures rooted not in extraction, but in care, equity, and permanence. Next slide. And I just want to give a thanks to many of those who's funding or continue to fund in our project, the Social Science Humanities Research Council, the UBC Housing Supply Hub, and the Toronto, and most importantly, Toronto Metropolitan University, and last but least, who's continuing to fund our particular project, the Ministry of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis, for that. I have no doubt this is going to be the beginning of a powerful new set of discussions around the issues you've identified. I'm going to very quickly move to Cheryl Case as introduced. Cheryl, as you can see on the clock with Dr. Lewis's presentation, we've run a little longer than we had thought. So you're going to have to be a little faster to get through, I think, about 10 minutes if you can. And I know you have about 23 slides, so that's going to require you to move very quickly, but I want you to have every minute you can. So over to you, Cheryl.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, that was a great presentation. Thank you, Nimoy. Yeah, so we've been very honored to have the support to sponsor this TAP and work with the amazing volunteers that make ULI so special. Next slide. So a little bit about our team. Next slide. So we really work across Canada to support industry alignment around the fact that housing is a human right. We have this enshrined at the federal level, and we know that this takes having a robust nonprofit sector and solidarity across socioeconomic groups. So, you know, when it comes to grassroots organizers, to industry execs, to government execs, we all need to be working together to actualize this concept and this right to housing. Next slide. And it really takes an economic development approach, taking leadership and expertise from folks from all different types of disciplines working together on an aligned mission. Next slide. So just to give you an idea of like what does it look like when communities are supported to plan with housing as a human right in mind, we found actually this is a map that we produced as part of our housing and focus study that we did in 2018. And so we asked, you know, folks on low income, retired seniors, compassionate homeowners, some developers were in the room as well. What would the neighborhood look like if housing was a human right? And this was in the Danforth and Maine neighborhood. And you can see that they actually support a dramatically increased level of density in their neighborhoods. They also desire to see more nonprofit and co-op housing in particular. The co-op housing, I think, is evidence of the interest people have of having some kind of agency over their space. Next slide. So I really see that the community effort for affordable housing and industry commitments to increase the supply actually go along really well together. So we've developed a roadmap for redevelopment plans to confront systemic racism as a key strategy, bringing together our knowledge over the past 7 years. And we've successfully engaged over 50,000 individuals in consensus building around equitable land use planning and supported nearly 4,000 units of affordable housing being advanced. And we're focused on areas adjacent to transit, really looking to ensure that folks are able to stay in their neighborhood as we leverage and build stronger communities through housing development. Next slide. So we're talking a lot about Toronto, but it's important to note that these patterns of displacement are present in cities across Ontario. So here's a map of Mississauga, where you find the Huron Ontario LRT is actually going through a neighborhood that has the highest volume and density of visible minority renters. So as Nomoi highlighted, the racialization of displacement is a pattern where we're seeing that the area where we're looking to have the most development is actually where we're having the most vulnerable populations. We also see the hatches where you have low income households. And so without government policy and collaboration across sectors, we won't be able to ensure that that development is affordable. But, you know, we're also seeing, broadly speaking, that the housing economy is tending towards market failure in terms of we're seeing significant barriers and slowdowns to actually generate new housing supply, with projects even, you know, being canceled in its tracks. Next slide. So how can land use planning economy collaborate to address displacement? Next slide. So what we're really looking to do is move from where we are right now, an unbalanced economy with widening poverty and increasing displacement, disenfranchised population, and exclusive extreme wealth accumulation, to one with social solidarity at its core. This is where we're able to work together across disciplines, expertise, lived experience to have more prosperous and stable populations, more democratic decision-making, and equitable wealth building, right? Think about if you are someone who's low income, unemployed, there's a lot of potential that that person can provide in terms of supporting the economy. We know that, you know, jobs in the trades, when we are developing housing at the scale required, there's a huge gap in terms of labor. And so there's a labor gap more broadly within our sector that we really need to address in order to see the supply being built at a scale. And what happens when we build housing at scale required? Well, the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association finds that by increasing Canada's now market housing share from 3.5 to 7%, we can actually grow our economy by $136 billion by 2031. Next slide. So solidarity barrier number 2, of course, is the scale of housing deficit. Next slide. So this is why we built the Neighborhood Investment for Targeted Yield of Affordable Housing assessment tool. So with this, we're looking at the development targets that are set by the city and the province, construction costs, how much is the cost to actually build, And we found that Little Jamaica, which is a neighborhood in Toronto around the Hill and Eglinton to the Eglinton Avenue West subway station, would require $1 billion alone to achieve its municipal and provincially set housing targets. This is really important to note because oftentimes you'll find community organizers will target developers individually, but really it's a systemic issue where collectively as a society, we're not investing enough into housing. So rather than thinking about it as a site-by-site issue, it's really a systemic issue where we need to be investing a lot more money into housing. Next slide. Consolidated barrier number 2 is ecosystem deficiencies. So next slide. So this is where we come together. CompliCITY actually hosting our resident summit on May 29th. And ecosystem deficiencies really speaks towards the gap wherein folks of different professions would benefit from being able to share knowledge with one another. Within the city building sector, there's a lot of great knowledge, nonprofit, within faith-based groups. And so Resident Summit is a space where we all come together and share our knowledge. And so we had a workshop last year where we identified, what are the stakeholders who had the greatest amount of power or greatest amount of alignment. And this is where we were able to think about, well, who do we need to be engaging more? And so we can find that from those who attended the summit last year, nonprofit sector was identified as having a lot of alignment and a lot of power. But also there's a lot of power that is not being leveraged, for example, with property owners, within the banking industry, and with private sector developer providers. How can we actually build stronger relationships across different groups? And we're having 2 amazing workshops this year, looking at finance, but also labor. Next slide. Next solidarity barrier is lack of solidarity within the labor force. So next slide. So this is the labor force of city building itself. And so this is why spaces like ULI are so important, because this is a space where industry professionals are able to come together, share knowledge, and explore ideas and advanced solutions that economically is not really quite yet funded to explore, but the passion, the drive, and the knowledge on how to do so, it definitely is there. And so, we've hosted a variety of events. ULI with this TAP has been an incredibly valuable experience, getting the expertise of your fantastic panel, as well as the over 60 experts that provided insight to the panelists. Next slide. So preserving Black communities apartment housing affordability at transit in Toronto was one of the key components of our roadmap for redevelopment plans to confront systemic racism. It was sponsored by City Planning in partnership with the City of Toronto, confronting anti-Black racism unit. Really glad that the Toronto Centre at HQ ULI also provided funding and support, with Goodman hosting space for us to have one of our workshops. And so I'll share with you guys. So this, the ULI TAP provided about 30 plus recommendations. So my favorite 3 are the 3 that I listed below, which is that, to pursue for 60% of new housing to be affordable or non-market, for 66% of existing affordable housing rental to be protected. This is earmarked to the affordability before transit announcements in Jane Finch. And then to establish a task force inclusive of Black resident leadership through a speculative displacement and loss of affordability. So this is my favorites, but this is not about me, right? This is about community and community efforts. So we're going to go to the next slide. So we hosted a workshop with the Jane Finch leaders. And so in that workshop, we had community leaders from Jane and Finch. City of Toronto was also there, as well as some philanthropic organizations. And so, what was key that came out of that workshop is that there's a strong desire to advance solutions that were noted. Next slide. But the community also recognized that a lot of the solutions that were put forward in the report were things that the community has been pushing for a long time, right? Folks have been working on this since 2017 and earlier. Unfortunately, change is slow, but while we're slowly changing and improving, people's lives are being massively impacted, right? So how can we actually accelerate the pace of progress? So with this report, actually been using this to help guide and help put a fire under us in terms of really thinking about how can we accelerate progress in seeing investment into solutions that community have been identifying. Next slide. And so we put a survey February to March 7th. We had 300 people respond to that survey. So I'm going to give you a really quick teaser in terms of the results of that survey, looking at just the results from the Jane and Finch group, but we did have folks from across Ontario provide their feedback. So in terms of the recommendations from the ULI TAP report, the top aligned solutions recommended by the ULI TAP on equitable transit-oriented development. Folks wanted to see climate-friendly retrofits and training for Black leaders to access jobs in planning housing and sustainable development. On affordable housing solutions, they wanted to see an evaluation of city programs' effectiveness. Are they working? They also wanted a task force to evaluate and propose solutions. And then on community collaboration, the prioritized recommendations is evaluated by the community in terms of what ULI proposed, ULI members proposed, is that they wanted to see collaboration with community to invest in public spaces, and then also to build capacity for local Black resident leaders through training, technical assistance, funding, and celebration. So next slide. And the last gap is economic rigidity. Next slide. So I'm going to end off with this. It's really about the difficulties in changing an ecosystem. Next slide. So we have this thing here, the community labor calculator. So the Canadian Institute of Planners put together two really great surveys. One looked at the value of labor, and we found that $97,000 was around the average income of a community planner in development, in the community development sector. And so, you know, the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, the Canadian Institute of Planners, all cities across Ontario have identified there's a need for more planners. And we know also from our work with community and grassroots folks that there's a huge interest of folks to do this type of work. However, it's currently significantly underpaid. This is just one example of local leaders in Little Jamaica who volunteer to support the development of the Eglinton Community Land Trust, as well as affordable housing solutions. So they, you know, they only secured about $100,000 of investment, but they actually volunteer at a tune of an additional $400,000. So if we're really valuing affordable housing, we need to be investing in housing as important jobs that folks should be doing in order to produce the required outcomes to see these amazing recommendations from ULI TAP reports put into action. So that is the conclusion of my presentation. The City of Toronto is doing amazing work with their Community Development Action Plan within Jane Finch, within Mount Dennis, the Community for All plan. There's a lot of really great examples, but I'll close here as we know we're pressed for time.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you, Dr. Lewis, for putting forward in front of a very large ULI audience, about 230 people tuned in, some very powerful information and some very powerful ideas of how the impacts that Dr. Lewis is spoken to in his research are being addressed by efforts such as that Cheryl is leading with CP planning. We're at time, unfortunately. I know that there were a couple of questions. Dr. Lewis, one quick question was, right now, you're in terms of sharing those slides, are we able to share those slides now, or we should be holding? I know you're going to be publishing your journal, and my guess is that we're waiting until your journal is published, but maybe you could quickly jump on and let us know the answer to that.
I can definitely share these slides from today.
Okay, well, there's the answer to a couple of people who asked the question. The recording will eventually be made available. I'm not sure the exact timelines, but it will be public. So people who've asked that question. There was another deeper policy question, unfortunately, we didn't get to. But we absolutely will be keeping on top of this major important piece of the city building equation in Toronto. So stay tuned to ULI and other organizations for what I think has been a big milestone that we just had today in this information shared by Dr. Lewis. No time to talk about future events, but there's always future events at ULI Toronto. I'm going to sign off on time as always. Thank you all, audience, for tuning in. See you soon.